The world had seen leaders rise. The world had seen leaders fall. But it had never seen a leader quite like Ibrahim Traoré, a man who walked with the calm of a scholar but carried the fire of a revolution in his chest. Because Traoré didn't step into power for luxury, he didn't arrive for applause, he didn't rise for fame. He rose because the people could no longer breathe. Because a nation wounded by years of fear, corruption, and foreign dominance needed someone who dared to stand when everyone else knelt. And Traoré stood. He stood without hesitation, without permission, without fear. He became the mirror that forced Africa to look at itself, not as a continent of struggle, but as a continent of strength, wisdom, and unstoppable potential. Every speech he delivered carried weight. Not the weight of politics, but the weight of truth. The kind of truth that shakes structures. The kind of truth that forces empires to listen. When he spoke, the crowds didn't just hear him, they felt him. Because he spoke like someone who carried the voice of every farmer, every mother, every child, every worker, every African who had been told for generations to stay quiet. And that is why his words traveled. Across deserts, across oceans, across borders, across the minds of millions. They traveled because they were honest. They traveled because they were fearless. They traveled because they were necessary. Soon, villages that had never seen electric lights echoed with his speeches played on cracked phones. Children mimicked his bold posture as if copying the blueprint of courage. Women, who had survived years of silence, found their voices rising with the same fire that burned in him. Traoré's rise was not a political event. It was spiritual. It was generational. It was the awakening of a continent rediscovering its pride. And while foreign powers whispered in boardrooms, drawing maps and planning pressure, Africa was drawing courage. Africa was planning unity. Africa was preparing to reclaim its destiny. Because Traoré did something that scared the world. He reminded Africans that they are not weak, they are not dependent, they are not voiceless. He reminded them that Africa does not need permission to stand tall. The youth looked at him and saw possibility. The elders looked at him and saw the return of dignity. And the world looked at him and saw a wave they could no longer control. But Traoré wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling at the cameras. He wasn't basking in applause. He knew this was only the beginning. Rebuilding a nation is not a moment, it is a war. Not a war fought with guns, but with principles, ideas, grit, and sacrifice. And Traoré was ready. Ready for the storms, ready for the pressure, ready for the challenges that would try to break him. But they won't break him, because he is not standing alone. Behind him stands a nation. Behind him stands a continent. Behind him stands a generation that has finally opened its eyes. This is not a chapter. This is not a headline. This is not another fleeting moment in African history. This is the beginning of a new legacy. A legacy written not by colonizers, not by foreign analysts, not by those who profit from Africa's silence, but by Africans themselves. And Ibrahim Traoré is the first line of that legacy. This story is far from over. In fact, the real storm hasn't even begun. But when it does, Africa will not face it in fear. Africa will face it in power. Because Africa has found its voice, and the world will have no choice but to listen. But what makes this moment truly historic is that it's not driven by politics. It's driven by awakening. A spiritual uprising, a psychological liberation. For decades, Africa carried chains not just on its land, but on its mind. Chains built from narratives, from foreign control, from stolen futures. But today, those chains are cracking. Not because someone handed Africa freedom, but because Africa remembered its own. Traoré didn't rise by accident. He rose because the people were ready, because the continent was ready, because history itself was ready. Across Burkina Faso and across the entire continent, a new energy is spreading, quiet but unshakable. The energy of a people who finally realize we are not begging for respect, we are reclaiming it. Farmers who once whispered now speak with confidence. Students who once feared now ask questions boldly. Elders who once stayed silent now share wisdom without hesitation. Because one man's courage can awaken millions. But Traoré knows something deeper. A movement built on hope must become a movement built on action. And that transition is where the real storm begins. The storm of rebuilding. The storm of resisting foreign pressure. The storm of unlearning old fears. The storm of teaching a new identity to a new generation. And Africa is ready. Ready to stand without bending. Ready to rise without apologizing. Ready to speak without being silenced. Foreign nations watch nervously, not because Africa is dangerous, but because Africa is finally becoming powerful in its own way. Not through force, but through unity, pride, and clarity. This is what scares them. A continent that believes in itself is a continent that no longer needs permission. Traoré walks with no crown, no golden symbols, no diamonds around his neck. Yet he carries more authority than many kings. Because true power does not shine, it resonates. True leadership does not command, it inspires. And true revolution does not come from violence, it comes from awakening. The rise of Africa will not be a single event. It will be a series of moments. Moments like this. Moments where one man's truth sparks a continent's rebirth. This story is not slowing down. It's accelerating. The drumbeat is getting louder. The footsteps are multiplying. The fire is spreading. And somewhere, deep within the heart of Africa, a voice echoes through the land. We are done bending. We are done begging. We are done staying silent. A new generation has stepped forward, a generation unafraid, a generation unbroken, a generation that carries both the wisdom of its ancestors and the vision of its future. And Ibrahim Traoré is not the final chapter. He is the introduction, the spark, the signal, the beginning of a movement that will outlive every headline, every government, every attempt to silence it. Because this is bigger than politics, bigger than borders, bigger than any leader. This is Africa rising. And nothing, no empire, no army, no pressure can stop a people who have finally remembered who they are.